Welcome back to another impactful episode of the PSTA Podcast. I am your host, Craig King, and I am here with yours truly. Well, not yours truly. Well, I guess if you said it, it's yours truly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
The best guest in the whole wide world, Patrick Kelly. Say hello to the people.
Hello to the people. It is a new year. It's the same guest on the PSTA Podcast.
Yes. We are excited for another round of the legislative session. I know you are excited, Patrick. Hope you got plenty of rest over the break.
I did. I slept well over the holidays because there is no easing into the 2024 legislative session. It's going to go 0 to 100 real fast.
Yeah, we have a lot to get to in a short amount of time because we like to respect your time. We know you're probably on the way to school right now or out for your morning walk or run, accomplishing those New Year resolutions. But let's jump right into it, Patrick. I know this year when I looked at our legislative agenda, I noticed something a little different in the front, a listing of our top priorities. Let's just jump into that.
Yeah. We wanted to make sure that our policy agenda, which is really comprehensive. It's a big document. I'm too wordy. My students would tell you I'm too wordy. I acknowledge this. That amongst all the great ideas in that agenda that's reflective of all the great recommendations for our members, that we prioritized the policy actions we think were most critically needed in South Carolina because we acknowledge the General Assembly has limited time. They're part-time legislators that meet for 3 days a week for 5 months of the year. There's only so much you can do in that calendar. So we highlighted 4 big ones. 2 of them are generalized. One is around educator salaries. We think educator salaries have to continue to go up to reverse the educator shortage that we see in this state. And the other one is around school safety because we know that there are ongoing threats to school safety and to student wellness and well-being in South Carolina and nationally. And we think we've got to be proactive in addressing that and not just responding to a tragedy when it occurs. The other 2 priorities are specific pieces of legislation that have made it through points of the legislative process. The first is H 4280, the Educator Assistance Act, that's made it out of the House. We think that that is a critically important bill to enhance educator retention by reducing some of the burdens on educators and, to be frank, just enhancing the respect for the profession as it's established in state policy. And then the other bill is S-125, which has passed the Senate. It's sitting in the House. We think it would enhance educator recruitment in South Carolina by making education majors eligible for the same enhanced lottery scholarship dollars that currently math and science majors in college are receiving. We think that that's a tool that would work. We also think that the money is there. CHE announced recently that it got over $100 million in lottery funds that have not been expended in recent years because there weren't as many students that qualified for scholarships as they were anticipating. We agree with Governor McMaster. I can't think of a better use for those funds than enhancing the scholarship amounts we're giving to our future educators.
Yeah, and so one word came to me while you were talking, Patrick, and the word respect. I think generally most people have some level of respect for educators, but sometimes that doesn't translate into policy and mandates that we put on teachers. But the 4 priorities that I feel like we're fighting for with PSTA, it helps to bring back that respect that we know teachers deserve. Yeah, I mean,
so even in our current climate where a lot of institutions in our society are under attack, the narrative is that teachers are valued and that teachers are difference makers. That's what people will say. Mm-hmm. But words and actions aren't always the same thing. Right. And what's really critically needed, and I heard this as a member of the Teacher Recruitment and Retention Task Force last year, was teacher after teacher in public hearings and in listening sessions saying that they didn't feel valued by the actions taken by policymakers. And so we think that each of those 4 prioritized policy actions in our agenda would not just speak the language of respecting educators, it would walk the walk. To use the old, don't just talk the talk, walk the walk.
Right, yeah.
You act in those 4 policy areas, and you're walking the walk of respecting educators in South Carolina in the 2024 legislative session.
Excellent. Speaking of priorities and teachers and policy, the governor's budget has been released. So talk about that.
Yeah, so Governor McMaster released his executive budget on Friday afternoon. It's important for everybody to realize, because this happens every year, there's some confusion. The governor puts out his budget, but it's important to note it is not the state budget. The governor does not have the authority to create or pass the state budget. That is the legislature's power and purview. All the governor can do, and I say all lightly because it's still a significant power, but the governor's power is simply to propose a budget to the legislature. And so the governor got his budget out on Friday in advance of the legislature coming back to town Tuesday. January 9th at noon, the legislature comes back in for the second session of the current term of the General Assembly. And so the governor's put this proposal out there. For a lot of his predecessors, the executive budget was mainly just a policy proposal that pretty much went straight in the trash can at the State House. Mm-hmm. Governor McMaster is different in the regards that he has been highly successful in not just using his executive budget to advance his policy priorities, he's actually got them implemented. And he's done a really effective job of working with legislators to ensure that what he puts in that executive budget gets translated into actual spending and actual state programs. And so any executive budget would be significant, but given his track record, what Governor McMaster puts out is a pretty big deal.
All right. Any highlights that you want to bring to the forefront about the budget?
Yeah, I hesitate to call anything the education budget when education already accounts
just
for
to give our members just a viewpoint of.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note that education already accounts for not quite half, but a large portion of the state budget annually. In the coming year, according to our state's budget forecasters in the Revenue and Fiscal Affairs Office, the state is looking at roughly a $750 million increase in recurring funds, meaning revenues that the General Assembly should anticipate will be there year after year after year. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of money. It's also important to note that's less money than the General Assembly has had the prior 2 years to work with. So we're not looking at a recession, we're not looking at budget cuts, but we're not looking at as much available revenue growth as we've seen in recent years. Within that $750 million proposed or projected increase, Governor McMaster is proposing taking $250 million of it, 1/3 of all state revenue growth, and putting it into the State Aid to Classrooms program, which is the state's primary line item for sending money to local school districts. Whether you think the state spends enough money on public education or not is a debate that can be had, has been had, will always be had. But mathematically, it's pretty hard to argue that $250 million is not a significant portion of $750 million.
Most definitely.
That's a third.
Yeah.
That State Aid to Classroom program is flexible. Districts can do a lot with that money, but it is intended primarily to fund the salaries of any individual that is paid according to the statewide minimum salary schedule for educators, so your teachers, your counselors. What the governor is proposing beyond the $250 million increase is a $2,500 increase to statewide minimum teacher pay. So currently, statewide minimum teacher pay is $42,500. The governor would bump that to $45,000, keeping the state on track of reaching the governor's long-stated goal of minimum pay of $50,000 by 2026. But the governor's budget is also different in how it handles salary because it's also going to recommend, and it is recommending, a whole-scale revision to the teacher salary schedule. And this is going to be important for people to look at closely and to share their individualized concerns with legislators because this isn't a budget proposal when it comes to salary that will be uniform in its application to individuals in a way that prior salary actions of, say, a $2,000 bump to every cell on the salary schedule. This is different. He's proposing a whole-scale reform.
Wow, that's going to be interesting to watch. And, to our PSTA members, kind of leads me to my next question, Patrick. If you talk to if you come to my household and talk to me and Tasia, my wife, communication is key. If you talk in any meaningful relationship, communication is key. And so we want our members to be empowered with correct information. So talk about what they can expect. Many of our returning listeners, they already know what to expect, but many of our new listeners that are listening, tell them what they can expect from you and from PSTA throughout the legislative session, so they are well informed, but also can take that information to implement advocacy efforts, whether it's letter writing, phone calls, seeing their elected official back at home, or visiting the State House.
Yeah, so this is perfectly timed because the governor released his executive budget on Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock. PSTA members got a Legislative Alert Network email at 2:30 telling them what was in the executive budget. And like I said, a proposed overhaul of the salary schedule that changes the number of steps, that changes the number of lanes, meaning do you get paid based on bachelor's or bachelor's plus 18 or master's plus 30. We try to be succinct on this podcast because we hope that nobody's commute to school is long enough to manage a full-scale discussion of a fundamental overhaul of a salary schedule.
Right.
But that email does. Mm-hmm. And so every Friday during the legislative session, PSTA members should expect between now and the second Thursday in May that come every Friday, they're going to get an email that does three things. Number one, it's going to tell them what happened last week. Number two, it's going to tell them what's coming in the next week. And number three, it's going to give them some quick, easy ways to engage in advocacy on policies that are pertinent before the General Assembly at the moment, that will be an efficient and effective use of member time. That could be sending emails, that could be making a phone call, but the email will always clearly delineate how to go about taking those steps. So if you're a PSTA member, check your email from Friday for greater detail on what the governor has done with salary schedules in his proposal, as well as more details because there's a lot of money in his budget for school safety and for instructional materials and bus drivers. And so all that's in that Legislative Alert Network email. If you're a PSTA member and you don't see that email, you need to send us an email at info@palmettoteachers.org and let us know that you're not receiving the Legislative Alert Network email so we can check our database and figure out what's going on because we want our members to be equipped with that information on a weekly basis.
Yeah, and in addition to that email on Friday, on Monday we are planning to have the podcast released that morning that highlights what was in that Friday legislative agenda. So that'll be another way for you to access information and not to get too much in the weeds of this, Patrick. It's important that you receive those emails. And yes, you may see an article in a newspaper that says this is going to happen. And that bill was proposed and has no co-sponsors. And it's not going to see the light of day. And so you may not see Patrick talking about that in the legislative agenda or his Legislative Alert Network. And you're like, well, I just saw this article talking about this. Sometimes there's a reason for that, because if it's not going to even see subcommittee because it doesn't have co-sponsors, then there's nothing you'd be worried about because it has to be able to be heard within the committee, correct?
That's right. I mean, one thing we are committed to at PSTA is helping our members efficiently engage in advocacy. That's right. That's part of why we have purchased the online platform that allows people to send emails and phone calls to their representatives, because we know that teachers are short on a lot of things. Their salaries are short, their supplies in their classroom are short, their copy codes are short. Yep. But the thing that they're missing the most is they don't have time.
That's right.
That is the number one resource teachers miss. And so when we send information out to members, we want to make sure that it is information that is critically important for them to have because it could lead to something. We know that teachers don't have time to keep up with every single bill that's been filed. There are literally thousands of bills that have been filed over the last 2 years in the General Assembly, and most of them will never see the light of day. The irony of you bringing this up, Craig, is right before we sat down to record this, I got a phone call from a reporter And I'm not going to say where, because I'm not trying to pick on the reporter that this happens, but the reporter wants to do a story on a bill that was pre-filed, and he literally said, I know this bill is not likely to get a subcommittee hearing, but this is interesting to viewers. And I agree, it is interesting. It makes for interesting public discourse. But for teachers with limited time,
absolutely,
we want to send out the info that is most important and most actionable. If somebody wants to have a full-blown, dorky, wonky policy conversation of every bill that's been filed in South Carolina, man, I'm your dude. You just tell me where to be. We will have a hamburger and a milkshake, and we will talk this thing through.
He will.
But we're not going to do that in the emails because we know your time is valuable.
That's right. So expect a lot from us. And before we wrap up today and I give Patrick the final word, we are excited about another legislative activity, I would call it, that we do here at PSTA, our Legislative Hill Days. We have about 15 scheduled, and these are teacher forums from all across the state. From the low country to the Midlands to the upstate, that will be convening here at the State House on different days to advocate for their profession. So all those school districts and teacher forums that we're anticipating, and other groups like the Counseling Association and school librarians, we're excited to have you come and join in the fight for advocacy. And so, Patrick, I'll give you the last word before we sign off today.
Yeah, I mean, just be ready for an active legislative session. This is an election year. This is the last year of a 2-year term of the General Assembly. Policies will move fast, and policies will potentially have a really big impact on schools and on education and on teachers and on students in South Carolina. So buckle up. Get ready. Maybe take one more nap before January the 9th. That's right. But we're going to need members to be ready to engage and advocate. And if people have questions, to the point you brought up earlier about seeing something in a news report that didn't show up in a Legislative Alert Network email, members email or call me all the time asking, well, what about this bill?
Yeah.
Please reach out to us and let us help you with that. Because, again, you don't have a lot of time. We'll help you with it and reduce the time burden.
Well, thank you, Patrick, our most favorite guest in the whole wide world. This is Craig King, your host. We'll talk to you next time.